You have exactly 1 week to clear your things out of the master bedroom. My sister Jasmine said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, as she slid a manila envelope across the mahogany dining table. Mom and Dad kept their eyes glued to their plates, perfectly silent. I looked down at the 7-day eviction notice resting next to my cranberry sauce. Then I reached into my designer bag, pulled out the certified property deed they had no idea existed, and slid it right back. Actually, I smiled, you have 24 hours. The look of absolute terror that washed over my brother-in-law's face is something I will cherish for the rest of my life. My name is Zuri. I am 35 years old and I spent my entire adult life acting as the financial cleanup crew for my family. Before I tell you how a single piece of paper destroyed a decade of their lives, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family while someone else played the golden child, hit that like button and subscribe. You are going to want to hear how this Christmas dinner ended. Growing up in our affluent neighborhood outside Atlanta, my parents, Roland and Vivian, cared about exactly one thing: image. Our sprawling brick estate with its wraparound porch and meticulously manicured lawn was their stage, and we were just the actors expected to play our parts perfectly for the neighbors and the church congregation. But the reality behind the expensive velvet curtains was always a terrifying financial tightrope walk. As a senior financial auditor, I saw the cracks in their facade early on. I just never expected those cracks to swallow me whole at my own dinner table. It was Christmas Day, and the dining room smelled of roasted turkey collard greens and the expensive pine candles my mother insisted on burning for holiday ambiance. We were seated around the massive mahogany table that I had personally paid to have refinished last spring. At the head of the table stood Preston, my sister Jasmine's white husband. Preston worked in wealth management, or at least that was the vague title he threw around at country club mixers and family gatherings. He stood there carving the Christmas turkey with an unbearable level of unearned authority, sawing through the meat while lecturing my father about the state of the stock market. Jasmine sat across from me, casually sipping her champagne. She is 3 years younger than me, 32, and has been the undisputed golden child since the day she was born. She was wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that I knew for a fact they could not afford on Preston's fluctuating commission checks. Jasmine spent her days curating a pristine, wealthy lifestyle on social media, pretending to be a self-made entrepreneur, while constantly borrowing money she never intended to repay. I was quietly eating my sweet potatoes, enjoying the rare moment of family peace, when Jasmine reached into her oversized designer tote bag. She pulled out a crisp manila envelope and tossed it casually across the table. It landed right on top of my plate, the heavy paper brushing against my wine glass. I looked at the envelope, then up at my sister. "What is this, Jasmine?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly even. "Open it," she said, her lips curling into a smug, triumphant smirk. Preston stopped carving the turkey and set the knife down on the serving platter, puffing his chest out as he watched me. I picked up the envelope, peeled back the metal clasp, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The bold black letters at the top screamed at me: "Official notice to vacate." It was a formal 7-day eviction notice listing my name and the address of the very house we were currently sitting in. I read the words twice, making sure my eyes were not playing tricks on me. I looked over at my parents. My father, Roland, suddenly found his dinner roll incredibly interesting, refusing to make eye contact with me. My mother, Vivian, took a long, slow sip of her Cabernet, her face completely unreadable. "I am sure you are surprised," Jasmine said, crossing her arms and leaning back in her velvet dining chair. "But Preston and I have been talking. We are ready to start trying for a baby next year, and we need the space. Our townhouse is just too small to raise a family." Mom and Dad agreed it makes the most sense for us to take over the main estate. We are going to completely renovate the entire first floor to make it more modern. I stared at her, the sheer audacity of her words hanging in the warm, cinnamon-scented air. "Take over the estate," I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. Preston cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Look, Zuri," he said, using that condescending corporate tone he always reserved just for me. "Your parents are getting older. They need someone who can truly manage a property of this magnitude. They have graciously decided to gift the house to Jasmine and me so we can secure the family legacy. You are a single woman. You do not need a 5-bedroom house all to yourself. It is frankly selfish of you to take up so much space when we are trying to build our future." I turned my gaze to my mother. The woman who had birthed me, who had watched me sacrifice my 20s and 30s to keep this family afloat, was now calmly buttering a piece of bread, as if her son-in-law had not just ordered me out of my own home. For 7 years I had quietly paid the property taxes on this estate. I had replaced the roof when it caved in during a storm. I had paid the utility bills every single winter when my father's business ventures failed. I did it all silently to protect their pride in our community. "Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the thick silence, "are you actually going along with this delusion?" Vivian finally looked up, her expression hardening into a mask of pure irritation. "Zuri, please do not make a scene on Christmas. Your sister needs this house for her brand. She is going to be a mother soon, God willing. You have a great job, you make excellent money. You can easily just go get a nice little luxury apartment downtown. It is time for you to move out and let your sister step into her blessings." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My mother was sitting there draped in a cashmere shawl I had bought her for her birthday, calmly telling me to pack my bags so her favorite daughter could have her dream house for free. They were throwing me away. After everything I had done, I was just a placeholder to them. A temporary caretaker who was expected to quietly bow out the moment the golden child demanded the keys. For a split second, the room spun. The old Zuri, the obedient daughter who desperately craved her parents' approval, would have cried. She would have begged. She would have tried to reason with them, listing off all her sacrifices, hoping they would finally see her worth. But the 35-year-old woman sitting at that table had spent the last decade reading balance sheets, untangling financial messes, and protecting her own peace. I knew exactly who these people were. And more importantly, I knew a secret they had desperately tried to bury. Preston picked the carving knife back up, a victorious grin plastered across his face. So he said cheerfully, "I know 7 days is a tight turnaround, but I have already called some movers for you. They will be here on the 2nd of January. We want to start knocking down the kitchen walls by mid-month to get the open concept Jasmine wants." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound echoed in the quiet dining room, causing my father to finally look up in sheer confusion. I wiped my mouth with my linen napkin, perfectly composed, and reached down into my leather handbag, resting on the floor beside my chair. "You are right about one thing, Preston," I said, pulling out a thick legal folder bound with a blue ribbon. "It is a beautiful house, and it would be a shame to lose it." I opened the folder, extracted the heavy notarized document inside, and placed it gently on the table directly on top of the fake eviction notice. I slid it across the polished mahogany until it hit Jasmine's water glass. I leaned forward, folding my hands under my chin. "But Mom and Dad cannot gift you this house, because Mom and Dad have not owned this house for 3 years. I bought it directly from the bank when Dad gambled away the mortgage and let it go into foreclosure. My name is the only name on the deed." The color instantly drained from Preston's face. Jasmine's jaw dropped open as she stared down at the government seal. I smiled, looking right into my sister's panicked eyes. "So actually, Jasmine, you have exactly 24 hours to get your things and get out of my house." The silence that fell over the dining room was so absolute you could hear the hot wax dripping from the holiday candles onto the silver centerpiece. For a long 10 seconds, nobody moved. Preston just stared at the thick document resting against Jasmine's water glass, as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. He blinked rapidly, the smug corporate confidence melting off his face and leaving behind a pale, panicked mask. Jasmine let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. She looked at our parents, then back at me. "This is a joke," she said, though her voice trembled. This is some kind of sick, bitter joke, because you are jealous. We are starting a family. Dad, tell her to stop playing games. My father did not look up. He sat rigidly in his chair, his hands gripping his linen napkin so tightly his knuckles were turning gray. He looked like a man who had just been caught running from a crime scene. I am not playing games, Jasmine, I said softly. I do not play with my money, and I certainly do not play with my property. Go ahead, Preston. You work in wealth management. Pick it up and read it. Tell your wife if that county clerk stamp looks fake to you. Preston reached out with a slightly shaking hand. He pulled the heavy packet of papers toward him, flipping open the cover page. His eyes darted frantically across the legal jargon, the official seals, and the bold signatures at the bottom. I watched his throat bob as he swallowed hard. He flipped to the second page, then the third, desperately searching for a loophole, a mistake, anything he could use to invalidate the nightmare unfolding in front of him. But there were no mistakes. I am a senior financial auditor. When I execute a contract, it is bulletproof. This is impossible. Preston muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He looked up at my father, his eyes wide with confusion and rising anger. Roland, what is this? You told me the house was fully paid off. You told me you were signing it over to us tomorrow morning. My father finally raised his head. He looked older than his 60 years in that moment, the facade of the wealthy, successful patriarch crumbling into dust. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Let me help you out, Dad, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. Since you seem to have lost your voice, I will explain it to them. 3 years ago in November, while Jasmine was busy posting pictures from her luxury vacation in Tulum, this house was exactly 3 weeks away from a public foreclosure auction. Jasmine gasped, her hand flying to her chest. That is a lie, she shrieked. Mom and Dad have plenty of money. They had an image of plenty of money. I corrected her, keeping my tone perfectly measured. But image does not pay the mortgage. Dad took out a massive second line of credit on the estate to fund a series of terrible investments and high-stakes poker games he thought he could win to cover his losses. He gambled away the equity. He hid the notices from the bank until the sheriff literally showed up at the front gate to deliver the final warning. I looked at my mother. Vivian was staring at me with a mixture of terror and pure fury. She hated the truth. She had spent her entire adult life avoiding the truth, wrapping herself in expensive clothes and country club memberships to hide the rotting foundation of her marriage. They came to me crying. I continued my gaze, sweeping across the table. They begged me not to let the community know they were bankrupt. They begged me to save them from the humiliation of being locked out of their own home in front of the entire church congregation. So I did what I always do. I cleaned up the mess. I liquidated my stock portfolio, drained my savings, and sat in the bank manager's office. I bought the house for cash to clear the immediate debt, and I assumed the remaining mortgage under my name. Preston dropped the papers onto the table as if they burned his fingers. His face was transitioning from pale white to a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. I let you all stay here, I said, my voice dropping an octave because I actually care about this family. I paid the taxes, I paid the insurance, I paid the maintenance, all while keeping the secret, so Dad could keep his pride. I asked for nothing in return except peace. I was perfectly content to let you live here indefinitely. I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle over them, until today. Until you decided that my silent generosity was a weakness. You thought you could conspire behind my back, forge some imaginary transfer of property, and hand me an eviction notice in the very dining room I own. You thought you could throw me out onto the street just so Jasmine could have an open-concept kitchen for her Instagram videos. Zuri. How could you? My mother suddenly hissed. Her voice was vicious, completely devoid of the sweet maternal tone she used in public. How could you bring this up right now? On Christmas, you are completely humiliating your father. The sheer audacity of her statement almost made me laugh again. I am humiliating him, I asked. Mom, You sat there drinking your wine while your son-in-law told me I had 1 week to pack my bags. You told me to go find a small apartment. You tried to throw your own daughter out of her own house to protect a lie. It is the family home, Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking as genuine panic finally set in. You cannot just take it from us. You owe us. You are my sister. I do not owe you a single thing, Jasmine. You have spent your entire life being handed everything on a silver platter. And the one time you actually have to face reality, you throw a tantrum. You wanted to play real estate mogul. You wanted to be the lady of the manor. Well, now you get to find out what real estate actually costs. Preston stood up so fast his chair tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor. He slammed both of his hands onto the table, making the silverware rattle against the china plates. "This is fraud," Preston shouted, a vein throbbing in his forehead. He pointed a trembling finger right at my face. "You coerced an elderly man into signing over his primary asset. You manipulated him when he was under financial distress. I will take you to court, Zuri. I will have this deed thrown out by a judge so fast your head will spin. You are not kicking us out of this house." I looked up at him, completely unbothered by his sudden display of aggression. "I am a corporate auditor, Preston. I document everything. I have the bank records, the transfer receipts, and a legally binding video recording of Dad admitting he was of sound mind and willingly selling the property to avoid foreclosure. It is ironclad. You will not even make it past a filing clerk, let alone a judge." I picked up my wine glass, took a slow, deliberate sip of my Cabernet, and set it back down. "So let me make myself incredibly clear," I said, making eye contact with each of them one by one. "The 7-day notice you gave me was cute, but my notice is legally binding. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever fits in your cars and vacate my property. If you are still inside these walls by tomorrow evening, I will not be calling a moving company. I will be calling the police to report you for trespassing." Preston stood frozen for a fraction of a second before the reality of my words actually processed in his brain. The smug, polished mask of the successful wealth manager completely dissolved. A deep, angry red crawled up his neck and blotched across his cheeks. He slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany table so hard the silver platters rattled, and my mother let out a startled gasp. "This is a lie," Preston roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the dining room. He pointed a shaking finger at the property deed resting on the table. "You are a glorified accountant, Zuri. You do not have the liquid capital to buy a house in this zip code. You printed this off the internet. It is a pathetic, desperate forgery, and I am not going to sit here and let you extort my family." Jasmine was entirely incapable of handling any situation where she was not the center of adoration. She leaped up from her chair, her face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You ruined Christmas!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, stomping her foot like a toddler. She threw her hands up in a wild, dramatic gesture. As she flailed, her diamond bracelet caught the edge of the heavy crystal gravy boat resting in the center of the table. The heavy crystal tipped over and shattered against the serving platters. Thick brown gravy washed across the pristine white linen tablecloth, pooling around the expensive centerpieces and soaking into the base of the roasted turkey. It was a perfect, messy physical representation of exactly what had just happened to their carefully constructed delusion. "Look what you made her do!" my mother shrieked, jumping up from her chair and grabbing a cloth napkin to dab frantically at the ruined table. Vivian was more concerned about the imported linen than the fact that her son-in-law was currently hovering over me with his fists clenched. I remained seated, resting my hands neatly in my lap. "I am not extorting anyone, Preston," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level to contrast with his erratic screaming. "I am simply informing you of your new living arrangements. The county records are public. You can look them up on your phone right now if you know how to navigate a basic government website." Preston did not reach for the county records. Instead, he reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. He gripped it tightly, staring down at me with a look of absolute venom. "You want to play hardball?" he sneered, unlocking the screen. "Fine. Let us see how confident you are when the police show up. I am calling 911 right now. You are out of your mind if you think you can pull this scam on us. You are going to be arrested for fraud and trespassing. My father finally found his voice. Preston, wait. Roland pleaded, his voice thin and shaky. Let us just talk about this as a family. We do not need to involve the authorities. Dad knew the deed was real. He knew that the moment the police arrived, the carefully guarded secret of his financial ruin would be out in the open. But Preston was too blinded by his own arrogance to listen to my father. He assumed Roland was just trying to protect me. No, Roland, Preston snapped, holding up a hand to silence my father. We are not protecting her anymore. She has lost her mind. Preston dialed the 3 numbers and pressed the phone to his ear. He stood up a little straighter, his chest puffed out. He was relying entirely on his privilege. In his mind, he was a wealthy, respectable white man standing in an affluent neighborhood, and I was just an angry, uncooperative black woman who dared to challenge his authority. He fully expected the police to arrive, take one look at the dynamic, and drag me out of my own home in handcuffs. Yes, I need an officer dispatched immediately, Preston said into the phone, his voice suddenly transforming into a tone of calm, measured concern. It was a terrifyingly quick switch from the red-faced screaming just moments before. I am at a family gathering, and we have an individual here who is becoming highly aggressive and unstable. I sat back in my chair watching him put on the performance of a lifetime. Yes, she is refusing to leave the premises. Preston continued pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. She is producing forged legal documents and claiming she owns the property. My wife is pregnant, and this woman is creating a hostile and physically threatening environment. She just smashed our dinnerware. We need her removed immediately before she hurts someone. He lied effortlessly. Jasmine was not pregnant, and she was the one who had shattered the gravy boat. He was weaponizing the police against me using buzzwords he knew would trigger a rapid response. He wanted them to come in hot. He wanted me to be afraid. He expected me to panic, to stand up and beg him to hang up the phone to negotiate my surrender, just to avoid the humiliation of being escorted out by law enforcement. Instead, I reached forward and tapped my fingernail against the polished wood of the table. Put it on speaker, Preston, I commanded. Preston stopped pacing. He glared at me, pressing the phone closer to his ear. I said, "Put it on speaker." I repeated, my voice louder and firmer this time. "Let everyone hear the lies you are telling the dispatcher." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, but his ego would not allow him to back down. He pulled the phone away from his face and tapped the speaker button. The confused voice of the 911 dispatcher echoed through the dining room. "Sir, are you still there?" the dispatcher asked. "Do you need an ambulance?" Before Preston could formulate another lie, I stood up from my chair and projected my voice clearly across the room. "Hello," I said smoothly. "My name is Zuri. I am the sole legal owner of this property. You can verify my identity and the property records when your officers arrive. I would greatly appreciate it if you sent a car right away. I have a disgruntled family member in my home who is having a violent meltdown, destroying my dining room and refusing to vacate the premises after being served a verbal eviction notice." Preston's jaw actually dropped. He stared at me in total shock, completely derailed by the fact that I had just hijacked his emergency call and used it against him. "Ma'am," the dispatcher said, her tone shifting to one of serious business. "We have 2 units in the area. They will be at your location in approximately 4 minutes. Please ensure no one escalates the situation physically until they arrive." Preston scrambled to take the phone off speaker. He mumbled a quick thank you and ended the call, shoving the phone back into his pocket. He was breathing heavily now, the panic returning to his eyes. He looked over at Jasmine, who had frozen mid-tantrum, and then down at my father, who was holding his head in his hands. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Preston told me, though. His voice lacked the booming confidence from earlier. "When those cops walk through that door, you are going straight to jail." I picked up my linen napkin, dabbed a tiny drop of spilled water off the table, and sat back down. "I am not going anywhere, Preston, but I strongly suggest you figure out which one of those designer suitcases you plan to pack tonight." The red and blue flashing lights of two patrol cars pierced through the frosted glass of the front door, casting erratic shadows across the foyer. The heavy knock that followed made my mother flinch. Vivian clutched her cashmere shawl tightly around her shoulders, her face pale with the realization that her precious neighborhood reputation was currently parked in our driveway for all the country club members to see. Preston immediately sprang into action. He ran a hand through his hair, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt, and marched toward the door. He was desperately trying to compose himself, slipping effortlessly into the role of the concerned, victimized patriarch. I picked up my blue ribbon legal folder from the dining table and followed him at a leisurely pace, watching his performance unfold. Preston pulled the front door open. Two police officers stood on the porch. One was an older white officer with a graying mustache, and the other was a younger black officer holding a notepad. "Officers, thank God you arrived so quickly," Preston said, his voice dripping with manufactured relief. "Please come inside. I am the one who called. We have a highly unstable family member refusing to leave our property. She has become hostile and is trying to extort us with forged documents. She even started destroying the dining room. My wife is terrified." The officers stepped into the foyer, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. They glanced past Preston and looked into the dining room where the shattered crystal gravy boat and ruined tablecloth were on full display. Jasmine took her cue. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, standing near my mother and producing soft theatrical sobs. The older officer turned to Preston. "Are you the homeowner, sir?" Preston stood tall. "Yes," he lied smoothly. "My wife and I are taking over the family estate. Her parents gifted it to us." Before Preston could spin another web of fiction, I stepped into the light of the chandelier. "Good evening, officers," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and devoid of any emotion. "I am Zuri. I am the woman who spoke with the dispatcher." The younger officer looked at me, then back at Preston, clearly sensing the massive disconnect in the room. "Ma'am, the man here says you are trespassing and creating a disturbance," he stated. "I am not trespassing," I replied, walking right past Preston and handing my driver's license directly to the older officer. "I am the sole legal owner of this property. The man who just lied to you is my brother-in-law. He does not pay rent, he does not have a lease, and he has absolutely no ownership stake in this house." Preston scoffed loudly, shaking his head. "Officers, please do not listen to her. She printed some fake deed off the internet to try and scare us. She is a disgruntled spinster who is jealous that my wife and I are starting a family. You need to escort her off the premises immediately." I ignored Preston completely. I opened my blue folder and pulled out the original notarized property deed along with a certified letter from the bank showing the mortgage transfer and the wire receipt from 3 years ago. I handed the entire stack to the officers. The older officer took the documents. He pulled a small flashlight from his vest and clicked it on, carefully examining the raised notary seal on the heavy paper. He cross-referenced the name on the deed with my driver's license. The foyer was dead silent. The only sound was the crackle of the police radio on the officer's shoulder. Preston shifted his weight from foot to foot. "It is a fake, officer," he insisted, though his voice was starting to lose its confident edge. "Just look at it. There is no way a single woman in her 30s bought a house in this zip code." The older officer clicked his flashlight off. He looked at Preston with an expression of deep unamusement. "Actually, sir," he said, "this is a legitimate county-issued deed. The seal is authentic. Miss Zuri is the registered owner of this estate." Preston's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. The younger officer stepped forward, his eyes scanning the terrified faces of my family. He looked at my father, who was standing quietly near the staircase. "Sir," he asked Roland, "are you the previous owner of this property?" My father looked at the floor. He could not bring himself to look at Preston, and he certainly could not look at me. "Yes," Roland whispered. "Speak up, please," the officer instructed. "Did you sell this property to your daughter 3 years ago?" "Yes," my father said, his voice cracking with shame. "I sold it to her. It is her house." Jasmine let out a genuine wail of despair, burying her face in her hands. Vivian closed her eyes, utterly defeated. The illusion was dead, and the police were the ones writing the obituary. Preston was backed into a corner, but his ego refused to let him surrender. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "But she lives here with us," he stammered. "She cannot just throw us out onto the street. We have rights. We established residency. I am going to sue her for an illegal eviction." The younger officer flipped his notepad shut and leveled a cold stare at Preston. "Sir, you need to lower your voice and step back. In this state, unless you have a signed lease agreement or proof that you pay rent, you are legally considered a guest in this woman's home. You are not a tenant. You are an invited guest, and the homeowner has just informed us that your invitation has been revoked." Preston looked at the officers in sheer disbelief. "Are you serious?" he demanded. "You are taking her side. You are going to let her throw a pregnant woman out in the cold on Christmas." "I do not care what day it is, and I do not care about your family drama," the older officer said firmly. "I care about the law, and the law says this is her house. Now, Miss Zuri told the dispatcher she gave you a 24-hour verbal notice to vacate the premises. Is that correct, ma'am?" "Yes, officer," I replied, maintaining eye contact with Preston. "They have until tomorrow evening to remove themselves and their belongings." The officer nodded and turned his attention entirely to my brother-in-law. "You heard the homeowner, sir. You have until tomorrow evening to pack your things and leave peacefully. If we get called back to this address tomorrow night, and you are still inside these walls, it will not be a civil dispute anymore. We will arrest you for criminal trespassing. Do you understand me?" Preston stared at the two officers, the reality of his total lack of power finally crushing him. He was not the wealthy patriarch. He was not the authority figure. He was a broke man, sleeping in his sister-in-law's house, and he had just been ordered to leave by the police he had weaponized against me. He gave a weak, humiliating nod. "We will file an incident report regarding this visit," the older officer told me, handing back my license and my folder. "If they cause any more property damage or refuse to leave tomorrow, do not hesitate to call us back. We will have units patrolling the area." "Thank you, officers," I said politely. "I appreciate your professionalism. Have a safe holiday." I walked to the front door and held it open for them. The police walked out, their heavy boots thudding against the porch steps. I closed the heavy wooden door, turned the deadbolt, and faced my family. Preston was staring at the floor, his face bright red and his fists clenched at his sides. Jasmine was crying hysterically into my mother's shoulder. My father looked like a ghost. I did not say a single word to any of them. I simply clutched my blue folder to my chest, walked past the shattered gravy boat in the dining room, and headed up the stairs to the master bedroom. I locked my door, changed into my silk pajamas, and went to sleep in the house that I owned. I woke up at exactly 7 in the morning, feeling more rested than I had in a decade. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's financial secrets was gone, replaced by the crisp, undeniable reality of my own power. I took my time getting out of bed, enjoying a long, hot shower, before slipping into a comfortable cashmere sweater and heading downstairs to the kitchen. The house was eerily quiet. I fully expected to hear the sharp sound of packing tape tearing off the roll, the heavy thud of suitcases being dragged across the hardwood floors, or the frantic rustle of moving boxes. Instead, as I pushed open the swinging door to the kitchen at 8 o'clock, I found my parents waiting for me. Roland and Vivian were sitting side by side at the massive marble kitchen island. There were no cardboard boxes anywhere in sight, no overnight bags packed by the door. They were fully dressed in their Sunday best, sitting there rigidly, like a tribunal preparing to pass judgment on a criminal. My mother had a crumpled tissue tightly gripped in her hand, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw genuine, unscripted tears streaming down her face. But they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of absolute terror at the prospect of losing her precious social standing. Zuri, my mother, began, her voice quivering with a fragile, broken frequency. "Please sit down. We need to talk to you before Preston and Jasmine wake up." I walked right past them, opened the glass cabinet to grab my favorite ceramic mug, and poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee from the machine. "There is nothing to talk about, Mom," I said smoothly. "You should be using this time to pack your belongings." Vivian let out a loud, tragic sob, burying her face in her hands. "How can you be so cold?" she cried, her voice echoing off the subway tile backsplash. She gripped the edge of the marble counter as if she were about to collapse. "You are tearing this family apart over pieces of paper. Is that all we are to you? Just numbers on a ledger? We raised you. We gave you everything, and you are willing to throw your own sister out onto the street just to prove a point. You are destroying us over a house." I stirred a splash of oat milk into my coffee, the metal spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. "You gave me everything," I repeated, turning to face her. "Mom, I bought this house to save you from being completely homeless. I am not the one tearing the family apart. You are the ones who sat around a dinner table and handed me a fraudulent eviction notice with a smile on your faces." My father cleared his throat, trying to summon the booming, authoritative patriarch voice he had used to control me during my childhood. It sounded incredibly hollow now, stripped of all the financial power that usually backed it up. "Zuri enough," Roland said sternly, narrowing his eyes at me. "You made your point last night. You embarrassed Preston in front of his wife. You embarrassed your mother and me. You proved that you hold the cards. But now it is time to be the bigger person and fix this mess." I stared at him, genuinely fascinated by the depth of his delusion. "Fix this," I echoed, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Fix what exactly?" Roland leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the kitchen island. "Preston is threatening to leave Jasmine," he said, lowering his voice into a hushed whisper as if the walls were listening. "He is entirely humiliated. He feels emasculated by what you did to him in front of those police officers. He told Jasmine last night that if they do not secure this property for their future, he is filing for divorce. Jasmine has been crying hysterically in the guest room for 10 hours. You are going to ruin her marriage. I need you to call your lawyer this morning." My father continued, his tone shifting quickly from a request to a direct command. "I need you to draw up the paperwork to transfer the deed to Preston today. We will figure out a way to pay you back for what you spent on the foreclosure eventually. But right now you need to sign the house over to save your sister's future. It is your duty as her older sister." The sheer audacity of his demand washed over me like ice water. They were not asking for forgiveness for trying to kick me out. They were demanding my total surrender. They wanted me to reward their betrayal. I set my coffee mug down on the counter with a heavy thud. "Let me make sure I fully understand you," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You want me to sign over a multi-million-dollar estate to a man who just tried to illegally evict me because his fragile ego cannot handle the fact that a black woman owns the house he sleeps in?" "It is about family loyalty," Vivian interjected aggressively, wiping her eyes with the crumpled tissue. "You have always been so selfish with your money. You never want to help your sister." That was the match that lit the powder keg. I took a step closer to the island, my eyes locked directly onto my mother's face. "Selfish," I spat the word out like poison. "Let us talk about family loyalty, Mom. For the last 10 years, I have personally paid the property taxes on this estate. I paid $30,000 in cash for the new roof when it started leaking into your pristine sunroom. I pay the electric bill, the water bill, and the expensive landscaping fees every single month so you can maintain your perfect country club image for your gossiping friends." I turned my piercing gaze to my father, who was suddenly refusing to meet my eyes again. "While I was working 80-hour weeks at the accounting firm to keep the lights on in this house, you two were fully funding Jasmine's luxurious lifestyle. You paid for her lavish destination wedding in Maui. You bought her that Mercedes SUV she drives around town. You handed her thousands of dollars for luxury vacations to Tulum and Dubai, so she could pretend to be a wealthy influencer online, all while Preston's so-called wealth management career produced absolutely nothing. You sacrificed my financial security to buy her happiness," I said, the bitter truth ringing clearly in the quiet kitchen. And when your money finally ran out, when Dad gambled away the very walls keeping you warm, you expected me to just quietly absorb the loss. You expected me to step up, pay off your debts, and fade into the background. You honestly expected me to hand over my only major asset so Jasmine could keep playing house with a man who is clearly broke. Preston is not broke. Jasmine's voice suddenly pierced the air. I looked toward the hallway doorway. Jasmine was standing there in her expensive silk robe, her face puffy red and entirely stripped of her usual glamorous makeup. She glared at me with pure hatred. He is a highly successful broker. His money is just tied up in aggressive investments right now. You do not understand how real wealth works. I looked at my younger sister, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, detached pity. If your husband is so incredibly successful, Jasmine, he can easily buy you your own house by tonight. But he is not getting mine. I picked my coffee mug back up and walked toward the doorway, forcing Jasmine to step aside so I could pass. It is 8:15 in the morning, I called out over my shoulder without looking back at any of them. You have less than 12 hours before the police return to enforce the eviction. I highly suggest you stop begging for my property and start finding some boxes, because I am not signing anything, and I am absolutely not backing down. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving my parents and my sister standing in the wreckage of their shattered entitlement. I headed straight down the long carpeted hallway and stepped into my home office, shutting the heavy oak door firmly behind me. The lock clicked into place with a satisfying metallic snap. For the first time all morning, I exhaled deeply. I sat down in my ergonomic leather desk chair, booted up my work laptop, and prepared to spend the day reviewing client portfolios. I assumed my family would finally use the remaining hours to pack their bags. I underestimated my sister's desperate need for attention. Less than 45 minutes later, my personal cell phone resting on the edge of my desk vibrated violently. Then it vibrated again. And again. The aggressive, continuous buzzing rattled against the wood of the desk like a tiny jackhammer. I picked up the device and saw a steady stream of notifications rapidly filling up my lock screen. It was not just a few stray text messages. It was an absolute avalanche. I swiped down to open my alerts and saw a banner at the very top of the screen. Jasmine is broadcasting live on Instagram. I tapped the notification immediately, hitting the volume down button on my phone so I could listen quietly. The application loaded and the screen filled with my sister's face. She was broadcasting from the guest bedroom down the hall from my office. She had clearly spent the last 40 minutes meticulously styling herself to look entirely unstyled and victimized. Her hair, which had been perfectly flat ironed the night before, was now pulled into a messy, uneven bun. Her face was scrubbed completely bare of her usual heavy makeup, highlighting the redness around her eyes. She was drowning in an oversized, faded college sweatshirt. She looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly heartbroken. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. "Hey guys?" Jasmine sniffled into the camera, her voice trembling perfectly. She paused to wipe a carefully timed tear from her cheek. "I am so sorry to come on here like this. I know it is the day after Christmas and everyone is celebrating with their families, but I need prayers right now. My family is going through an unimaginable, horrific nightmare." I leaned back in my chair, watching the viewer count in the top corner of the screen skyrocket. 300 people. 800 people. Over 2,000 people were suddenly tuning in to watch her breakdown. My older sister, Zuri Jasmine, continued, her voice cracking as she looked directly into the camera lens. "She has done something so evil, I do not even know how to process it. Many of you know my dad has been struggling lately. His health is not great, and his memory is just not what it used to be. He gets confused easily." I scoffed out loud in the empty office. My father was as sharp as a tack. He was a brilliant manipulator and a terrible gambler, but there was absolutely nothing wrong with his cognitive function. However, the narrative of a declining elderly father played much better to her sympathetic audience. Zuri used his vulnerable state against him. Jasmine sobbed, burying her face in her hands for a brief moment before looking back up with wide, pleading eyes. She secretly manipulated him into signing over the deed to our family home years ago when he did not know what he was doing. We had absolutely no idea, and last night during Christmas dinner, she brought the police to our house. She served Preston and me with an eviction notice and told us we have to be out by tonight. Jasmine took a deep, shuddering breath and placed a protective hand over her completely flat stomach. The gesture was incredibly calculated. "We are trying to start a family," she whispered, letting a fresh wave of tears fall. "I might be pregnant right now, and my own sister is throwing me out onto the freezing street because she is jealous and bitter that I found a loving husband while she is still alone. She is stealing our parents' home and leaving us with nothing. Please just pray for my dad. Pray for my family to survive this betrayal." She ended the live broadcast abruptly, leaving her followers with the tragic image of her weeping face. Almost instantly, the damage bled out of the digital world and into my real life. The comments section on her video had been a waterfall of pure outrage, with people tagging my personal Instagram account calling me a monster, a thief, and a sociopath. I closed the social media app, but my text messages were already exploding. My family and friends, the people who had known me my entire life, were taking up pitchforks on Jasmine's behalf without asking a single question. Aunt Denise, who had not bothered to call me on my birthday in 2 years, sent a massive block of text. "I cannot believe you would take advantage of your own father's declining mental health," she wrote. "You are a disgrace to the entire family. You are going straight to hell for doing this to a pregnant woman. I am completely ashamed to share your bloodline." My cousin Jamal sent a rapid-fire series of messages. "Give them the house back, you greedy psycho. How could you do this to Uncle Roland? Preston is going to sue you into the ground, and we are all going to testify against you." Even members of our church congregation, people who had watched me grow up, were flooding my inbox. Sister Beatrice from the choir sent a passive-aggressive audio message quoting Bible verses about the sin of greed and the sanctity of honoring your parents, ending the message by saying she would be praying for my dark, corrupted soul. The old me would have panicked. The young, anxious version of Zuri would have immediately logged onto Instagram, typed out a frantic emotional defense, and begged everyone to believe the truth. I would have felt the overwhelming urge to post the bank statements, the transfer receipts, and the truth about my father's gambling addiction, just to clear my name. I would have desperately wanted them to know that I was the hero, not the villain. But I was not that woman anymore. I was a senior financial auditor. I knew that arguing with a narcissist's flying monkeys was a massive waste of time and energy. When you argue with a lie, you inadvertently validate it. You give it oxygen. Jasmine thought she was winning the war by controlling the public narrative. She was relying on the fact that our community valued appearances over facts. She wanted me to feel isolated, hated, and pressured into surrendering the house just to make the social media bullying stop. I did not respond to a single text message. I did not block anyone. Instead, I opened the screen recording application on my phone. I had already recorded Jasmine's entire broadcast from start to finish. I methodically went through my inbox and took clear date-stamped screenshots of every defamatory comment and every hateful text message from my relatives. I saved all the files into a secure cloud folder labeled defamation evidence. Jasmine did not realize that in the real world, social media tears do not hold up in a court of law, but documented slander absolutely does. I put my phone on silent, tossed it into my desk drawer, and turned my attention to my laptop. It was time to stop playing defense. I opened my internet browser and searched for the top-rated private security firms in the Atlanta area. I found a highly reputable company that specialized in asset protection and high-risk evictions. I dialed the number, feeling completely numb to my family's theatrics. "Yes, good morning," I said when the dispatcher answered. "My name is Zuri. I am the legal owner of a private estate, and I have hostile guests who have been given a 24-hour verbal notice to vacate. I need to hire 2 armed security guards and a licensed locksmith to arrive at my address at exactly 7 o'clock tonight." After confirming the appointment with the dispatcher, I ended the call and set my phone back down on the desk. 7 tonight. The countdown was officially ticking. I had exactly 8 hours to prepare the house for a hostile transition. I knew from experience that desperate people do not pack up and leave quietly, and my family was the definition of desperate. I walked out of my home office and headed toward the main foyer. If 2 armed guards were going to be stationed at my front door all night, they would need space for their heavy equipment, and the locksmith would need completely unobstructed access to the master security panel hidden inside the coat closet. I grabbed the brass handle of the double doors in the hallway and pulled them open. The closet was an absolute disaster. Jasmine and Preston treated my home like their personal overflow storage unit. Expensive wool coats, designer boots, and a set of custom golf clubs were shoved into every available inch of space. I began aggressively pulling their belongings out, tossing the heavy coats onto the wooden entryway bench and kicking the boots into a messy pile on the floor. I did not care if the expensive leather scuffed. They were lucky I was not tossing their things directly into the front yard. As I reached up to the top shelf to pull down a bulky garment bag, the thick fabric snagged on something hard hidden in the shadows. I tugged it impatiently. A large vintage leather briefcase tumbled down from the top shelf. It was the exact same briefcase Preston carried around at family events like a theatrical prop to make himself look incredibly important. The heavy leather bag hit the hardwood floor with a loud thud. The brass latches, which were apparently broken and barely holding the thing together, snapped open upon impact. A massive wave of paperwork erupted from the interior, sliding across the polished floorboards like a paper avalanche. I let out an annoyed sigh. I knelt down on the floor, intending to scoop the messy pile of papers back into the briefcase and shove it into the pile of their junk. But as my fingers brushed against the top sheet of paper, the bold red capitalized letters immediately caught my eye. My hands stopped moving. I am a senior financial auditor. I spend my entire professional life looking at ledgers, contracts, and corporate financial statements. I can spot a numerical discrepancy from a mile away. What I was looking at on my hallway floor was not a minor discrepancy. It was a complete financial massacre. The first paper I picked up was a final notice from a luxury auto finance company. It was a repossession warning for Jasmine's Mercedes SUV. They were 3 months behind on payments, and the document explicitly stated that recovery agents were actively looking for the vehicle. I grabbed another stack of papers from the pile. Margin call warnings from a major national brokerage firm. Preston had been trading on margin gambling with money he did not actually have, and the market had clearly turned against him in a brutal way. The firm was demanding an immediate deposit of $200,000 to cover his catastrophic losses. My heart started beating a little faster as I dug deeper into the scattered mess. I found a thick, stapled packet from a premium property management company located in downtown Atlanta. It was an eviction notice. A real one signed by a civil court judge. Preston and Jasmine had not paid rent on their luxury townhouse in over 6 months. They were legally locked out of their apartment 3 weeks ago. The narrative suddenly clicked into place with sickening clarity. They were not moving into my house to knock down kitchen walls and renovate for a baby. They were not trying to secure the family legacy. They were trying to take over my home because they literally had nowhere else to go. They were completely homeless and entirely broke. I kept digging through the pile, totally ignoring the fact that anyone could walk down the hallway and catch me snooping. Near the bottom of the mess, shoved haphazardly into a faded manila folder, I found something much worse than bad debt. I found a legal summons. Preston was being sued by 3 of his former wealth management clients. The lawsuit alleged severe breach of fiduciary duty, unauthorized trading, and direct misappropriation of funds, embezzlement. Preston was not a successful wealth manager. He was a con artist who was desperately trying to stay one step ahead of total ruin. He had stolen money directly from his clients to fund Jasmine's designer wardrobe, her lavish trips to Dubai, and the fake glamorous life they flaunted on the internet. And now the bill was due. I sat back on my heels, staring at the scattered papers, breathing heavily as the puzzle pieces snapped together. That was why they needed the deed to my house so desperately. Preston did not just want a free place to live. He needed to legally own a multi-million-dollar asset so he could use it as collateral. He fully intended to take out a massive high-interest loan against my property to pay back the clients he stole from before the federal authorities got involved. He was going to leverage my home, drain every cent of the equity, and leave me holding the bag when his entire house of cards collapsed. A cold, sharp anger replaced the initial shock. My parents had sat at my kitchen island just an hour ago demanding I sign my house over to this man. They were willing to let me take the fall for a criminal. They were willing to let me lose everything I had worked for, just to protect Jasmine from the embarrassment of a failed marriage and a broke husband. I carefully gathered every single document from the floor, organizing them into a neat, undeniable stack of evidence. I did not put them back into the leather briefcase. I left the empty bag lying on the hardwood floor. I stood up, clutching the papers tightly to my chest, and walked quickly back to my home office. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and sat down at my desk. Jasmine wanted to play the victim on the internet. Preston wanted to weaponize the police against me. But they had just handed a senior auditor the exact paper trail needed to bury them both. I opened my laptop and started running the numbers. The glow of my laptop screen illuminated the dark mahogany of my desk as I began to build a custom spreadsheet. In my 10 years as a senior financial auditor, I have investigated corrupt corporations, mismanaged hedge funds, and greedy executives. I have seen every trick in the book when it comes to hiding money. But reviewing my own brother-in-law's financial records was a completely different experience. There was no sophisticated shell company or complex offshore account. It was just raw, arrogant theft. I started by logging the explicit debts. I typed the numbers from the eviction notice, the auto repossession warnings, and the horrific margin calls from the brokerage firm into the first column of my spreadsheet. The cell at the bottom of the screen automatically calculated the total. $2.4 million. That was just the money he owed to legitimate institutions. Then I opened the legal summons from the 3 former clients and started a second column. I read through the plaintiff's complaints, my stomach turning with every paragraph. These were not institutional investors who could absorb a loss. These were vulnerable people. One of them was an 80-year-old widow whose late husband had trusted Preston's firm to manage her pension. Another was a family who had invested their life savings into a college trust fund for their children. Preston had systematically drained their accounts, transferring the money into a private limited liability company registered under Jasmine's maiden name. I pulled up Jasmine's public Instagram profile on my second monitor. I wanted to see exactly how they had burned through millions of dollars of stolen money. I cross-referenced the dates of the fraudulent bank transfers listed in the legal summons with the dates of her most popular photo sets. The correlation was sickeningly perfect. On October 12th, Preston liquidated $40,000 from the widow's pension fund. On October 14th, Jasmine posted a video of herself unboxing a rare limited edition designer bag using the hashtag #selfmadeboss. On December 1st, Preston drained $75,000 from the college trust fund. On December 3rd, Jasmine uploaded a massive photo album from their luxury ski trip to Aspen, wearing head-to-toe designer snow gear and bragging about how her husband always spoiled her. Even the diamond tennis bracelet she had worn at Christmas dinner, the one that caught the light right before she knocked over the crystal gravy boat, was bought with stolen money. I found the jeweler's receipt crumpled at the bottom of the briefcase. It was purchased the exact same day Preston received his final warning from the brokerage firm. Instead of paying his debts, he bought his wife shiny objects to keep up the illusion of their wealthy lifestyle. But the most damning piece of evidence was not the stolen money or the designer bags. It was a single unsigned document tucked inside a plain white envelope. I pulled it out and smoothed the wrinkled paper flat on my desk. It was an application for a hard money loan. In the financial world, hard money lenders are the absolute last resort. They are private, unregulated lenders who charge predatory interest rates. They do not care about your credit score or your employment history. They only care about one thing: collateral. If you default on a hard money loan, they do not send collection agencies. They immediately seize the property you put up as collateral and auction it off to recoup their cash. I read the details of the loan application, my blood running completely cold. Preston was requesting a loan of $3 million. That was the exact amount he needed to pay back the brokerage firm and settle the lawsuits with his former clients before the Securities and Exchange Commission caught wind of the embezzlement. I looked down at the section labeled collateral. There, printed in crisp black ink, was the address of my family estate. The entire horrific scheme finally made sense. Preston and Jasmine never intended to move into my house to raise a family. They never intended to renovate the kitchen or build a nursery. They needed the deed to my property so they could pledge it to a predatory lender. If I had caved to my parents' demands this morning, if I had signed that deed over to Preston to save Jasmine's marriage, he would have submitted this application by tomorrow afternoon. The lender would have handed him $3 million. Preston would have used that money to pay off the people he robbed, effectively buying their silence and avoiding federal prison. And then, because Preston had absolutely no income and no way to pay the massive monthly interest on a hard money loan, he would have defaulted. Within 6 months, the private lender would have foreclosed on the estate. The house would be gone. I would be completely broke, legally tied to a fraudulent transfer, and potentially facing accessory charges for helping a known embezzler hide his assets. Meanwhile, Preston and Jasmine would have walked away completely clean, probably relocating to another state to start their scam all over again. They were planning to serve me up as a human shield to protect Preston from a federal indictment. I sat back in my leather chair staring at the screen. The sheer sociopathy of the plan was breathtaking. It required a level of emotional detachment that I could barely comprehend. Jasmine was my own blood. We had grown up in the same house. We had shared secrets as children, and yet she was perfectly willing to completely destroy my life, my credit, and my future just so she did not have to admit to her country club friends that she married a broke criminal. My thoughts immediately shifted to my parents. Vivian and Roland had cornered me in the kitchen, demanding I sign the house over. Did they know the full extent of this? Did they know Preston was facing prison time? My father was a man who obsessed over money, even when he did not have any. There was no way Preston could have hidden a $3 million deficit from him completely. My parents knew Preston was in serious trouble, and they chose to sacrifice me to fix it. I reached over and pressed the power button on my laser printer. The machine whirred to life, breaking the heavy silence of the office. I hit print on the custom spreadsheet I had just built. Then I scanned the legal summons, the hard money loan application, and the margin call warning, sending the digital copies directly to an encrypted folder on my secure corporate server. The printer spat out page after page of undeniable mathematical proof. I gathered the warm sheets of paper and organized them into a pristine chronological dossier. I slid the entire stack into a fresh red folder. I was no longer just a sister defending her childhood home. I was a financial auditor who had just compiled a bulletproof case for the federal government, and I was ready to use it. I grabbed the thick red folder from my desk and marched downstairs. The heavy silence of the house felt different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was toxic, thick with the unsaid truths my family had spent decades burying. I found my parents in the formal living room. They were sitting on the custom velvet sofa, speaking in hushed, frantic whispers. My mother was holding her cell phone, likely fielding more calls from her country club friends to manage the fallout of Jasmine's digital meltdown. My father was staring blankly at the unlit fireplace, nursing a glass of bourbon despite the early hour. I did not say a word as I walked into the room. I simply walked over to the glass coffee table and slammed the red folder down onto the surface. The sharp smack made both of them jump. "Read it," I commanded. My father looked at the folder, then up at me, his brow furrowed in irritation. "Zuri, we have already discussed this. I am not in the mood for more of your games. We need a solution, not more drama." "I am not playing a game, Dad. I am showing you exactly what your golden son-in-law has been hiding." I found his briefcase spilled in the hallway closet. Open the folder. Vivian sat up straight, her eyes narrowing. You went through his private belongings, she gasped, clutching a hand to her chest. Zuri, that is a massive violation of privacy. How dare you snoop through his things when he is a guest in this house? I ignored her completely, keeping my eyes locked on my father. Open it, Roland, or I will call the police back right now and hand it directly to them. My father saw the deadly seriousness in my eyes. He set his bourbon glass down on a coaster, leaned forward and flipped open the red cover. He stared at the top page. It was the spreadsheet I had created detailing the $2.4 million in debt. He slowly turned the page, revealing the eviction notice for their townhouse, then the margin calls, and finally, the legal summons from the 3 families Preston had robbed. I watched his face closely, waiting for the shock. I waited for the horror of realizing he had invited a criminal into his home. I waited for him to look at me and apologize for demanding I sign my house over to a man who was actively being sued for embezzlement. But the shock never came. My father did not gasp. He did not jump up in anger. He simply closed his eyes, let out a long, heavy sigh, and rubbed his temples. He looked like a man who had just been handed a bill he knew he could not pay. My mother did not even look at the papers. She looked away, staring out the large bay windows toward the manicured front lawn. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My hands, which had been perfectly steady all morning, began to tremble. You knew, I whispered, the horrific realization hitting me like a physical blow. I took a step back, looking back and forth between the 2 people who raised me. You already knew about this. My father opened his eyes and looked at the coffee table. We did not know all the exact details, Zuri. We did not know the numbers were this high. But you knew he was stealing money, I said, my voice rising in volume. You knew he was facing federal charges. You knew he was broke. Vivian finally turned to face me, her expression defensive and cold. Preston made some bad investments, she said sharply. He got in over his head. The market shifted, and he had to move some funds around to cover his clients' losses. It was a mistake, Zuri. He is not a bad person. He just needs a little bit of time to make the money back and quietly settle with those people before it goes to trial. Move some funds around, I repeated, utterly disgusted by her delusion. Mom, he embezzled life savings from an 80-year-old widow. That is not a mistake. That is a felony, and he was going to use my house to pay for it. I reached down, flipped past the summons, and pointed directly to the hard money loan application I had placed at the very back of the folder. Look at this, I demanded. He was going to use this estate as collateral for a $3 million loan from a predatory lender. He was going to take the cash, pay off the people he robbed to keep himself out of prison, and let the lender foreclose on my property. My father refused to look at the application. We were going to make sure he paid the monthly interest, Roland said softly. I was going to liquidate some of my retirement funds to help him make the payments until his firm bounced back. We just needed you to sign the deed over so he could secure the initial capital. It was a bridge loan, Zuri. Just a temporary bridge to get the family out of trouble. The room started to spin. They were completely detached from reality. They had sat in my kitchen just an hour ago and tried to emotionally manipulate me into signing away my entire net worth, fully aware that I was handing it over to a desperate criminal. Do you have any idea what would have happened to me? I asked, my voice shaking with a rage so profound it scared me. I am a licensed certified public accountant. I am a senior auditor. If I transfer a multi-million-dollar asset to a man who is currently under investigation for wire fraud, the federal government does not see that as a family favor. They see it as aiding and abetting. They see it as money laundering. You were willing to let me lose my license, my career, and my freedom just to bail him out. Vivian stood up, her face flushed with anger. She pointed a finger at me. You are being dramatic. No one was going to jail. We were protecting this family. Do you have any idea what would happen if the people at our church found out Jasmine married a thief? Do you know what the board members at the country club would say if the FBI raided their townhouse? The humiliation would destroy us. Your father and I have spent 30 years building our reputation in this community. We are respected. We are leaders. We could not let Preston ruin that. So you decided to let him ruin me instead, I stated. You are strong, Zuri. My mother shot back completely unapologetic. You always figure things out. You have a great career. You have no husband, no children. If you had to start over, you could do it. Jasmine cannot. She is fragile. She needs stability. We had to protect her marriage. We had to protect the family name. You were the only one who had the assets to fix this. I stood there staring at the woman who gave birth to me. She was looking at me not as a daughter but as a resource, a sacrificial lamb to be slaughtered on the altar of their social status. They did not care if I ended up bankrupt or in a federal courtroom, as long as they could still walk into Sunday service with their heads held high and pretend their lives were perfect. The last remaining thread of affection I had for my parents completely snapped. There was no more guilt. There was no more obligation. They had made their choice. I picked up the red folder from the table and held it tightly against my side. I want to be absolutely clear, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. Neither of you are my family anymore. You are strangers who happen to share my DNA. My father opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop him. Do not say another word to me, I commanded. You have until 7 o'clock tonight to get off my property. When the security guards arrive, anyone still inside this house will be physically removed. I suggest you go upstairs, tell your golden child to stop crying on the internet, and start packing. Because if I see any of you after the sun goes down, I am handing this folder directly to the authorities. I turned my back on them and walked out of the living room, leaving them sitting in the suffocating silence of their own ruined lies. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the heavy, aggressive footsteps coming down the second-floor hallway. I stopped on the landing and looked up. Preston was standing at the top of the staircase. He was no longer wearing his polished suit. He was in a wrinkled t-shirt, his hair disheveled and his eyes bloodshot. He was breathing heavily, gripping the wooden banister so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked down at me, then his eyes locked onto the thick red folder clutched in my hand. He knew exactly what I had found. And the look on his face told me he had nothing left to lose. I took another step up the carpeted stairs, my eyes locked dead onto his. Preston did not move out of my way. He stood squarely in the center of the upper landing, his broad shoulders blocking the pathway. The polished, condescending wealth manager, who had carved the Christmas turkey 24 hours ago, was completely gone. In his place stood a desperate, cornered animal. I reached the top of the stairs and stopped one step below him. Move, Preston, I said, my voice flat and completely devoid of fear. He did not move. Instead, his eyes darted from my face, down to the thick red folder clutched against my chest. A dark, ugly sneer twisted his features. You went into my briefcase, he said. His voice was no longer the loud, booming baritone he used to command the dining room. It was a low, raspy growl. You left your garbage in my hallway, I corrected him, taking the final step up onto the landing and forcing him to either step back or physically touch me. He took a half step backward into the narrow corridor, but he did not give me enough room to pass. I bumped into your bag. I continued keeping my posture perfectly straight, and I saw exactly what kind of man my sister married. You are a thief, Preston. You are a fraud facing multiple federal indictments, and you are trying to use my property to bail yourself out. The moment the words left my mouth, the atmosphere in the hallway changed. Preston reached out and slammed his hand against the wall right next to my head, trapping me between his arm and the wooden banister. He stepped directly into my personal space. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, and he used every bit of that height to loom over me. I could smell stale coffee, nervous sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of pure adrenaline radiating off his skin. You think you are so smart, Zuri, he whispered, his face just inches from mine. You think because you wear a nice suit and look at spreadsheets all day that you are untouchable. You are nothing. You are a lonely, bitter spinster who got lucky on a real estate deal. My left hand was resting casually against my hip, right where my smartwatch sat on my wrist. While keeping my eyes locked onto his bloodshot gaze, I slowly slid my thumb over the digital crown. With two subtle taps that I had practiced 100 times for discreet corporate meetings, I activated the voice recording application. A tiny haptic pulse vibrated against my skin, confirming that every word he was about to say was being captured in high-definition audio. I am smart enough to know that a $3 million hard money loan requires a clean title, I said, baiting him perfectly. And I am smart enough to know you are never going to get one. Preston leaned in closer, his jaw clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grinding. You are going to sign that house over to me today, he hissed. You are going to call your lawyer, you are going to draft the transfer, and you are going to hand me the deed by 5 o'clock this afternoon. And why exactly would I do that? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Because if you do not, I will absolutely destroy your life, Preston replied, the malice dripping from every syllable. Do you think I just sit around managing portfolios all day? I have access to some of the highest level trading algorithms in this city. I know exactly how your accounting firm operates. I know the exact digital architecture of your corporate servers because Jasmine bragged about your IT setup at Thanksgiving. He dropped his arm from the wall and pointed a finger directly at my chest, tapping it hard against my collarbone. I did not flinch. If you do not give me this house, Preston threatened, I will remotely plant a manufactured paper trail of insider trading directly onto your secure work laptop. I will generate fake wire transfers, offshore account pings, and fabricated emails tying you to illegal stock manipulation. It will look completely authentic. I will anonymously tip off the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they will raid your beautiful corner office before the week is over. He smiled, a sick, twisted expression of pure cruelty. You will lose your certified public accountant license instantly. Your firm will fire you. And when the federal prosecutors are done with you, you will be sitting in a minimum security prison for the next 10 years. You will lose the house anyway to pay for your legal defense. So you can either sign the property over to me right now and keep your precious little career, or you can watch me burn your entire life to the ground. He was trying to terrify me. He was banking on the fact that I had spent my entire life following the rules, building a pristine reputation, and avoiding conflict. He thought the threat of public ruin and federal prison would make me crumble just like it would have made my parents crumble. He assumed my corporate career was my biggest weakness. He had no idea it was actually my greatest weapon. I let the silence hang in the narrow hallway for a few seconds. I wanted the microphone on my wrist to pick up the ambient sound of his heavy breathing. I wanted the recording to be crystal clear. Are you done? I asked finally. Preston frowned, clearly confused by my total lack of panic. I am dead serious, Zuri. Do not test me. I reached up and firmly swatted his hand away from my chest. You are a terrible bluff, Preston. If you possess the technological capability to seamlessly hack a top-tier accounting firm and fabricate an untraceable network of offshore wire transfers, you would not be begging your sister-in-law for a house to pay off a margin call. You are not a criminal mastermind. You are a desperate man who stole from an 80-year-old widow because you are too incompetent to make money legally. His face flushed a violent dark red. He raised his hand, balling it into a tight fist. For a split second, I thought he was actually going to strike me. But he knew that if he crossed that physical line, the police would be back before he could even pack a bag. He slowly lowered his fist, his entire body trembling with rage. I stepped around him, breaking his physical trap, and walked toward the door of my master bedroom. I stopped with my hand on the brass doorknob and turned back to look at him. You have until 7 o'clock tonight, I reminded him, my voice echoing off the hallway walls. The security guards arrive at exactly 7. The locksmith arrives at exactly 7. If you are still inside this house, or if you ever try to contact me at my place of business, I will not just report you for embezzlement. I will hand the FBI a very clear high-definition audio recording of you attempting to blackmail a licensed financial auditor with fabricated federal crimes. Preston's eyes darted down to my wrist. The realization hit him like a freight train. The color drained from his face for the second time in 24 hours. He opened his mouth, but he was completely speechless. "Start packing, Preston," I said, "and tell my sister to stop crying on the internet. It is not going to save her." I opened my bedroom door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. I immediately synced the audio file from my watch to my secure cloud server, attaching it directly to the red folder dossier. The trap was fully set, and my family had just walked right into it. I woke up on Sunday morning to the sound of hushed, frantic voices downstairs. It was 8 o'clock. The 24-hour deadline I had set was rapidly approaching, leaving them with exactly 11 hours before the security guards and the locksmith arrived at my front door. I got out of bed feeling a strange sense of absolute calm. I walked into my closet and bypassed my comfortable weekend clothes. Instead, I pulled out a sharp, tailored emerald green pantsuit. If my family wanted to paint me as a ruthless corporate villain, I was going to dress the part. I walked downstairs to find my parents standing by the front door. They were dressed immaculately. My father wore his best charcoal suit, and my mother was draped in a sophisticated navy dress with her hair perfectly styled. They were preparing for their weekly performance at Greater Grace Fellowship, our affluent megachurch in the heart of Atlanta. They had not packed a single box. "We are leaving for service in 10 minutes, Vivian announced, refusing to look me in the eye. "You are coming with us. We have to present a united front. People are already talking because of what your sister posted online last night." I looked at her, genuinely amazed by her priorities. "You have less than 12 hours to move your entire life out of my house," I said smoothly. "And you want to spend 3 of those hours sitting in a pew pretending everything is fine." "We are not leaving this house," Roland stated firmly, adjusting his silk tie. "And you are coming to church. Pastor Davis is expecting us. Do not make this any worse than it already is, Zuri." I realized exactly what their strategy was. They thought that if they dragged me into the sanctuary surrounded by the elders and the congregation who had known me since childhood, the collective social pressure would finally break me. They wanted to use the weight of the church to force me into submission. They wanted me to feel so ashamed and isolated that I would sign the deed over just to avoid the public scandal. I smiled softly. "I am ready when you are," I told them. I turned around, walked back to my office, and opened my safe. I pulled out the original foreclosure notices with my father's signature, along with a copy of Preston's hard money loan application and the SEC summons. I folded the documents neatly and slid them into the inner zipper pocket of my leather handbag. I walked back out to the foyer, grabbed my car keys, and followed them out the door. We drove to the church in separate cars. I pulled into the massive parking lot of Greater Grace Fellowship right behind my father's luxury sedan. Preston and Jasmine had driven together in her Mercedes, the same vehicle that was currently marked for repossession. Jasmine stepped out of the car wearing a surprisingly modest, muted beige dress, completely devoid of her usual flashy jewelry. She looked pale and exhausted, playing the role of the terrified, victimized mother to be with absolute perfection. Preston walked beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes darting around nervously. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. We walked through the heavy glass doors of the church lobby. The atmosphere shifted the second we stepped inside. The usual warm greetings and polite chatter died down. People turned to stare, whispering behind their hands. Jasmine's tearful Instagram live broadcast had clearly made its way through the entire congregation. The ushers handed us our programs with stiff, awkward smiles. We walked down the center aisle toward our usual family pew near the front of the sanctuary. I felt the heavy, judgmental gaze of hundreds of people burning into my back. We took our seats. Preston sat on the far edge, nervously bouncing his knee. Jasmine sat next to him, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. My parents sat in the middle, staring straight ahead like statues. I sat on the opposite end, crossing my legs and resting my handbag on my lap, looking completely unbothered by the toxic energy radiating from my family. The choir sang their opening hymns, the announcements were made, and then the sanctuary lights dimmed. Pastor Davis stepped up to the acrylic pulpit. He was a tall, imposing man with a booming voice and a flair for dramatic sermons. He adjusted his microphone and looked out over the massive crowd. Today, Pastor Davis began his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system I was planning to preach from the book of Romans. But the Lord placed a different message on my heart late last night. A message about the sanctity of family. I saw Jasmine subtly lower her head, a tragic, brave expression on her face. She had clearly called him. She had spun her web of lies to the spiritual leader of our community, painting me as the greedy, heartless sister who was stealing the family estate and throwing a pregnant woman out into the cold. We live in a world that worships money. Pastor Davis preached, pacing slowly across the stage. We live in a society where people will turn their backs on their own flesh and blood for the sake of bricks and mortar. We see siblings tearing each other apart over inheritance. We see children coveting earthly possessions, forgetting that the greatest treasure we have is the family God gave us. The congregation was dead silent. Every single person in the room knew exactly who he was talking about. What good is it to gain a whole estate, but lose your soul? Pastor Davis thundered, his voice rising in volume. What good is a massive house if the walls are built on the tears of your family? God sees the greed in our hearts. He sees the pride that makes us value a piece of property over the well-being of our own parents and siblings. We must forgive one another. We must release our tight grip on our bank accounts and our legal documents and open our arms to our kin. He stopped pacing. He stood directly behind the pulpit, leaned forward and locked his eyes dead onto our pew. He stared right at me. Do not let bitterness convince you to cast your family out into the wilderness, Pastor Davis said softly, his words carrying a heavy, condemning weight. Repent of your greed before it destroys your family legacy. The entire sanctuary seemed to hold its breath. I could feel the eyes of the church elders sitting in the front row shifting toward me. I felt the gaze of the choir members behind the stage. They were all waiting for me to break. They were waiting for me to lower my head in shame, to cry, to run out of the sanctuary in disgrace. I did not blink. I sat perfectly straight in my emerald suit, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact with the pastor. I let a slow, knowing smile spread across my face. Preston stopped bouncing his knee. He glanced over at me, seeing the absolute lack of fear in my expression, and a fresh wave of panic washed over his face. He knew that I was not breaking. He knew that the church pressure tactic was completely failing. I reached down, unzipped the inner pocket of my handbag, and let my fingers brush against the cold, crisp paper of the foreclosure notices. The sermon was just the opening act. The real show was waiting for them in the lobby. The organ music swelled, signaling the end of service. The massive wooden double doors at the back of the sanctuary swung open, and the congregation began pouring out into the expansive sunlit lobby of Greater Grace Fellowship. I stood up from the pew, smoothing the front of my emerald green blazer. My parents had already rushed out ahead of me, eager to position themselves among the church elders to solidify their narrative. Preston and Jasmine trailed closely behind them. I took my time. I slung my leather handbag over my shoulder, feeling the comforting weight of the documents resting inside. As I walked down the center aisle, the whispers followed me like a physical breeze. People I had known since I was in the youth choir suddenly found the carpeting extremely fascinating as I passed by. Others offered me tight, pitying smiles, the kind usually reserved for the deeply disturbed. I stepped through the double doors and into the crowded lobby. The smell of expensive perfume and fresh coffee filled the air. I spotted my family immediately. They were gathered near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, surrounded by a tight circle of the most influential people in the congregation. Elder Thomas, a retired judge who commanded immense respect in our community, was standing there. Sister Beatrice, the head of the women's ministry who had sent me that hateful audio message the night before, was nodding sympathetically at my mother. I walked directly toward the exit, fully intending to leave them to their theatrics. But Jasmine had other plans. She saw me approaching the glass doors and broke away from the circle of elders. "Zuri, wait!" Jasmine called out, her voice loud enough to cut through the chatter of the crowded lobby. Hundreds of heads turned in our direction. The low hum of post-church conversation died out instantly. The lobby became a stage, and Jasmine was ready for her monologue. She rushed over to me, her face contorted in a mask of pure agony. She reached out and grabbed my arm, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric of my suit. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her carefully applied mascara. "Please, Zuri," Jasmine begged, dropping to her knees right there on the polished marble floor. It was a breathtaking display of manipulation. She clutched my hand, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. "I forgive you. Mom and Dad forgive you. We all forgive you for what you did last night. But please, I am begging you, find Jesus. Let the Holy Spirit soften your heart. Do not take our home away from us. I am carrying a child. How can you throw a pregnant woman out onto the street?" The collective gasp from the surrounding crowd was audible. Several women covered their mouths in shock. Sister Beatrice stepped forward, her face stern and self-righteous, positioning herself as my sister's protector. "Sister Zuri," Elder Thomas said, his deep voice carrying a tone of heavy disappointment. He walked over and placed a comforting hand on Jasmine's trembling shoulder. "We have all heard what is happening. The Lord calls us to be peacemakers. Your family loves you. Do not let the sin of pride and greed harden your heart against your own flesh and blood. Hand over the property and let us pray together for healing." My mother Vivian was standing just a few feet away, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. My father stood stoically beside her, playing the role of the heartbroken patriarch. Preston was hovering near the back of the circle, looking incredibly anxious. He wanted the social pressure to break me, but he was terrified of what I might say. I looked down at Jasmine, who was still kneeling at my feet, clutching my hand. I did not yank my hand away. I did not raise my voice. I did not exhibit a single ounce of the angry black woman stereotype they were all desperately hoping I would validate. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my arm. I took a half step back, creating a clear physical boundary between us. "Jasmine, you can stand up now," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the silent lobby. "The performance is over." Jasmine let out a loud sob, burying her face in her hands. Sister Beatrice glared at me. "Have you no shame?" Beatrice hissed. "Your sister is on her knees begging for mercy and you mock her. You are a disgrace to this congregation." I turned my gaze away from my sister and looked directly at Sister Beatrice, then to Elder Thomas. I looked at the faces of the people who had judged me without ever asking for my side of the story. "I have absolutely no shame," I replied, my tone perfectly, "even because I have done absolutely nothing wrong. My sister is not crying because I am stealing her home. She is crying because she has run out of people to manipulate." Elder Thomas frowned, his bushy eyebrows pulling together. "What are you talking about, Zuri? The deed to the family estate." "That estate belongs to me," I interrupted, cutting off the elder with polite authority. "I did not steal it. I bought it 3 years ago when my father secretly defaulted on the mortgage and the bank was 3 weeks away from foreclosing on the property." The shock that rippled through the circle of elders was instantaneous. Elder Thomas pulled his hand back from Jasmine's shoulder. My father Roland visibly flinched, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Vivian stopped dabbing her eyes and stared at me in pure horror. The perfect, wealthy image they had spent 30 years cultivating in this church was disintegrating right in front of them. "That is a lie," Preston suddenly shouted, pushing his way to the front of the crowd. His face was flushed red and a thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "She is lying to cover up her own extortion. Do not listen to her. She is mentally unstable." I turned my attention entirely to Preston. The moment I made eye contact with him, he physically recoiled. He remembered the hallway. He remembered the red folder. "I am not the one lying, Preston," I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. "And this entire spectacle has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus or forgiveness or family. It has everything to do with the fact that you are broke." Jasmine scrambled to her feet, her fake tears instantly vanishing as pure panic took over. "Zuri, shut up," she snapped, completely breaking character. I ignored her. I looked back at Elder Thomas, who was watching the exchange with a highly trained analytical eye. My brother-in-law is not a successful wealth manager, I announced to the crowded lobby. He is a fraud. He desperately needs the deed to my house so he can use it as collateral for a high-interest loan. And he needs that loan because he is currently facing multiple federal lawsuits for embezzling millions of dollars from his clients. The lobby erupted into chaotic gasps and shocked whispers. The phrase embezzling millions of dollars hung in the air like a detonated bomb. Preston lunged forward, his hands balled into fists. "Shut your mouth, you psycho!" he roared, completely losing his mind in front of the entire church. I did not flinch. I stood my ground, unzipped my leather handbag, and slid my hand inside. It was time to show the congregation exactly what the truth looked like. I pulled the thick stack of folded documents from the interior zipper pocket of my leather handbag. The crisp, sharp sound of unfolding paper cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the church lobby. Every eye in the room was glued to my hands. I separated the first batch of papers, smoothing out the creases, and held them out directly to Elder Thomas. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing nervously at my parents, before reaching out and taking the documents. Pastor Davis, who had rushed out from the sanctuary to see what the commotion was about, stepped up beside the elder to look over his shoulder. "Take a very close look at the dates and the signatures," I instructed them, my voice echoing clearly off the high vaulted ceilings. "Those are the original foreclosure notices from the bank. Notice the name printed on the debt. Roland. Now look at the final page. That is the transfer of deed signed by my father, legally selling the property to me in a desperate bid to avoid a public county auction. I paid off his massive gambling debts in cash so this family could keep pretending they were perfect." Elder Thomas reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his reading glasses, and slid them onto his face. He traced his finger along the red bank stamps, the official notary seals, and my father's undeniable signature at the bottom of the page. The respected judge read the numbers silently, his eyes widening with every line. He slowly lowered the papers and looked up at my father. "Roland," Elder Thomas asked, his deep voice thick with absolute disbelief. "Is this true? Did you bankrupt your family estate and sell it to your daughter?" My father could not even look the judge in the eye. The proud, image-obsessed patriarch of our family stared blankly at the polished marble floor and offered a slow, humiliating nod. Vivian let out a quiet, pathetic whimper, bringing both of her hands up to cover her face. The illusion of her immense wealth and flawless status, the very thing she had sacrificed her relationship with me to protect, was completely shattered in front of the exact people she wanted to impress. Sister Beatrice, who had been so quick to condemn me and defend my mother, took a slow step backward. Her self-righteous expression melted into profound embarrassment as she realized she had publicly backed a family of massive liars. "But that is just ancient history," I said, turning my body away from my ruined parents to face Preston directly. Preston was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tailored suit jacket. He was staring at the second stack of papers, still resting in my hand. "The real tragedy is what my sister brought into this family," I announced to the crowd. I looked right into Preston's bloodshot, terrified eyes. "Did you honestly think I would not look into your finances after you tried to illegally evict me from my own home? I am a senior financial auditor. It took me less than an hour to find the lawsuit filed by the 80-year-old widow whose pension you drained. It took me even less time to find the massive margin calls you ignored." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd of churchgoers. Several people physically recoiled, pulling their children closer to them. Embezzling from an elderly widow was a line that nobody in this community would ever excuse. Preston opened his mouth, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He just shook his head slightly, a pathetic, weak gesture of denial. But the most interesting piece of paper in your little leather briefcase was the hard money loan application. I continued raising my voice so every single person in the massive lobby could hear the absolute depth of his depravity. I turned back to Pastor Davis and Elder Thomas, making sure the leaders of the community understood the exact nature of the crime. He needed my house because he was going to use it as collateral for a $3 million loan from a predatory, unregulated lender. He was going to take that cash and pay off the vulnerable clients he robbed, hoping to silence them before the Securities and Exchange Commission kicked down his office door. And when he inevitably defaulted on that high-interest loan, he was going to let the bank take my home. He was going to leave me completely bankrupt and facing federal conspiracy charges, all while he and Jasmine ran off scot-free. The color drained out of Preston's face so rapidly it looked like a medical emergency. He went absolutely ghost white. The aggressive, roaring man who had tried to physically intimidate me in my upstairs hallway just an hour ago vanished entirely. In his place stood a terrified, cornered coward who suddenly realized his life was over. He looked frantically around the lobby. He saw the disgusted faces of the church elders. He saw men who had previously shaken his hand and respected him now clenching their jaws in pure anger. He looked at the heavy glass doors leading to the parking lot. He realized that the police and the federal authorities were going to be the very next people to hear this story. "You are crazy," Preston mumbled. His voice was incredibly weak, trembling so badly it was barely audible. He took a step backward, then another. "I am not listening to this," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly toward the exit. He bumped into a church usher, stumbled slightly, and then completely lost whatever remaining nerve he had left. He turned on his heel and shoved his way violently through the crowd of shocked congregants. "Get out of my way!" Preston yelled, physically pushing past an elderly woman who stumbled against a pillar. He hit the heavy glass exit doors with both hands, shoving them open with a loud crash, and broke into a full, desperate sprint across the sprawling asphalt parking lot. He did not look back. He did not call out for his wife. He did not care about the imaginary baby Jasmine was supposedly carrying. He just ran, his expensive leather dress shoes slapping loudly against the pavement as he sprinted toward his car to escape the consequences of his own actions. Jasmine was left standing in the dead center of the church lobby, completely abandoned by the man she had destroyed her own family to protect. The entire crowd watched Preston sprint away in a cowardly panic, and then they slowly turned their collective gaze back to her. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Jasmine looked around at the faces of her community, her eyes wide with shock and humiliation. There was no pity left for her. There were no comforting words from the elders. There was only disgust and profound judgment. Her perfect, highly curated social media life was completely dead, exposed as a hollow criminal fraud under the bright fluorescent lights of the church foyer. I calmly folded the remaining documents, placed them back into my leather handbag, and zipped it shut with a sharp final sound. I looked at my mother, my father, and my sister, who were all standing frozen in the wreckage of their social standing. "You have exactly 6 hours left," I told them softly, my voice carrying effortlessly through the quiet room. "I highly suggest you go home and start packing." I drove away from the church, leaving the ruins of my family's social standing scattered across the lobby floor. When I arrived back at the estate, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The reality of my ultimatum had finally penetrated my parents' thick wall of delusion. As I walked through the front door, I saw my father dragging 2 large, heavy suitcases down the main staircase. He looked exhausted, stripped of all the arrogant bluster he had carried for the last 30 years. My mother was trailing behind him, carrying a stack of designer garment bags. She did not look at me. She did not say a word. They loaded their belongings into the trunk of my father's sedan in complete silence. Just before 5 o'clock, my parents drove down the long driveway and turned onto the main road, officially abandoning the house they had sacrificed my financial security to keep. They did not leave a forwarding address, and I did not ask for one. At exactly 6:30, the private security team I hired arrived. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the house, and 2 massive, heavily armed security contractors stepped out. They wore tactical uniforms and carried themselves with the kind of quiet, imposing authority that instantly commands respect. I met them on the porch and handed them a printed list with the names and photographs of Preston and Jasmine. I explicitly instructed them that if my sister or my brother-in-law attempted to enter the property after 7 o'clock, they were to be considered hostile trespassers. 15 minutes later, the locksmith arrived in a branded work van. He immediately got to work drilling out the old brass deadbolts on the front and back doors and installing heavy-duty, high-security electronic locks. I stood in the foyer watching the brass shavings fall onto the hardwood floor, feeling the absolute finality of what I was doing. For 10 years, this house had been a physical prison of obligation. Now it was finally becoming my sanctuary. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times. The 24-hour eviction deadline had officially expired. The locksmith packed up his tools, handed me the new set of master keys, and drove away. The 2 security guards took their positions, one standing firmly on the expansive front porch, and the other patrolling the perimeter near the backyard patio. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and waited. I knew Preston was not going to let this go easily. A man facing federal prison does not just walk away from a $3 million lifeline. At exactly 7:15, the sharp squeal of tires tore through the quiet evening air. I walked to the front window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain. Jasmine's Mercedes SUV aggressively pulled into the circular driveway, parking at a harsh angle that tore up a patch of the manicured lawn. Preston threw his door open and marched toward the house. Jasmine scrambled out of the passenger side, clutching her designer purse, her face tight with anxiety. But they were not alone. A second car, a faded gray sedan that looked like it had not been washed in months, pulled up right behind them. A man stepped out. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit and carrying a scuffed leather briefcase. He had slicked back hair and the kind of frantic, aggressive energy you usually see on late-night television commercials for discount defense attorneys. Preston had clearly spent the last 6 hours desperately scrambling to find any lawyer willing to take his case on a Sunday afternoon. The 3 of them marched up the brick walkway toward the front door. The massive security guard standing on the porch immediately stepped forward, blocking their path and resting his hand casually on his utility belt. "This is private property." The guard stated, his voice a deep, unyielding rumble. "You need to step back." Preston did not step back. He puffed out his chest, trying to project authority, but he looked completely ridiculous standing in front of the armed professional. "We are not leaving," Preston shouted, pointing a finger at the heavy wooden door. "Tell the homeowner to come out here right now. We have legal documents." I watched the exchange from the window. I set my glass of water down on the console table and walked to the front door. I did not open it. I simply stood in the foyer, looking through the rectangular glass panels built into the center of the heavy wood. Preston saw me standing there. A smug, victorious smirk spread across his face, completely erasing the terrified coward I had exposed at the church. He gestured aggressively to the cheap lawyer standing beside him. The lawyer stepped past the security guard, ignoring the verbal warning, and slapped a piece of paper directly against the glass of my front door. "Read it and weep, Zuri." Preston yelled through the glass, his voice muffled but entirely audible. "You thought you outsmarted us with that deed, but you forgot one massive detail." I leaned closer to the glass, looking at the document the lawyer was pressing against the pane. It was a power of attorney form. "That is a durable power of attorney," Preston shouted, his smirk widening into a full, arrogant grin. "Your father signed it over to me 5 years ago when his health first started declining. It gives me total, unyielding control over his finances, his assets, and his real estate, which means your little property transfer 3 years ago is entirely fraudulent and legally void. He did not have the legal capacity to sell you this house without my explicit written consent." Jasmine stepped up beside him, a triumphant look flashing in her eyes. "You are done, Zuri," she yelled through the glass. "You cannot kick us out. We own this house. Open the door right now before we have our lawyer call the police on your guards." Preston crossed his arms, standing tall on the porch. He genuinely thought he had won. He thought he had found the perfect legal loophole to invalidate my ownership, trap me in a lengthy court battle, and force me to let them stay in the house while the court sorted it out. He was relying on the fact that the average person is terrified of complex legal threats. I looked at the piece of paper pressed against the glass. Even through the pain, I could see that the document looked entirely suspicious. The notary stamp looked faded, and the signature claiming to be my father's lacked his usual sharp cursive loop. It was exactly what I expected from a desperate man facing federal charges. It was a complete sloppy forgery. The security guard looked at me through the glass, raising an eyebrow, silently asking for permission to physically remove them from the porch. I did not nod. I did not call the police. I did not argue with Preston through the heavy wooden door. Instead, I reached out, unlocked the brand new deadbolt, and pulled the front door wide open. Preston almost lost his balance as the door swung inward. He caught himself, his arrogant grin returning in full force. He thought my opening the door was a sign of total surrender. He thought I was backing down. "Step inside, Preston," I said, my voice perfectly calm and dangerously polite. "Bring your wife and bring your attorney." Preston adjusted his jacket, looking at the security guards with a sneer of absolute superiority. He stepped over the threshold, walking into my foyer like he was a conquering king returning to his castle. Jasmine followed right behind him, her chin tilted up in defiance, walking past me without saying a word. The shady attorney trailed behind them, clutching his scuffed briefcase. "Close the door," I told the security guard. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, locking us inside. "You finally realized you lost," Preston said, turning to face me in the foyer. "It is about time. Now tell your hired muscle to pack up and leave. I am going to need your keys, and I expect you to have your bags packed by morning." "I am not packing anything," I replied smoothly. "I just prefer to handle matters of fraud in the comfort of my own dining room." I gestured down the hallway toward the formal dining room, the exact same room where they had handed me the fake eviction notice, just 24 hours prior. "Follow me," I instructed them. "Let us take a closer look at this magical document of yours." Preston scoffed, shaking his head. "You can look at it all you want. It is legally binding. You are just delaying the inevitable." He confidently marched down the hallway toward the dining room, eager to rub his supposed victory in my face. Jasmine walked beside him, clutching his arm, completely unaware that they were walking straight into an ambush. They turned the corner and stepped into the dining room. Preston opened his mouth to make another condescending remark, but the words completely died in his throat. He stopped dead in his tracks, his arrogant smirk instantly evaporating into thin air. Sitting at the head of the mahogany table, calmly drinking a cup of coffee and reviewing a thick stack of legal briefs, was not a terrified homeowner. It was my own lawyer. And unlike Preston's discount attorney, the man sitting in my dining room was a senior partner at the most ruthless, high-powered corporate litigation firm in the city. "Good evening," my lawyer said, looking up from his papers with a cold, clinical smile. "Please have a seat. We have a lot to discuss." Preston froze, his eyes darting between me and the impeccably dressed man sitting calmly at the head of my mahogany table. My attorney Sterling was a senior partner at one of Atlanta's most formidable corporate litigation firms. He did not handle petty family squabbles or basic real estate disputes. He handled high-stakes corporate fraud, and he radiated the kind of quiet, lethal authority that made opposing counsel sweat before he even opened his mouth. The discount lawyer Preston had dragged along suddenly looked incredibly small in his cheap, wrinkled suit. He cleared his throat desperately, trying to muster some authority, and stepped forward to slide the power of attorney document across the polished wood. Sterling did not stand up. He did not offer them a seat. He casually picked up the piece of paper by the very edge, as if it were contaminated waste. He pulled a silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and used the cap to point at various sections of the document without actually touching the ink. "This is a truly fascinating piece of fiction," Sterling said, his voice rich, deep, and entirely devoid of amusement. "Let us start with the notary stamp. You are claiming Roland signed this document in Fulton County 5 years ago. However, the notary commission number listed here expired 7 years ago. Furthermore, the signature itself is an incredibly clumsy forgery. Roland has a documented medical tremor in his right hand that is clearly visible on every legal document he has signed over the last decade. This signature was executed with a perfectly steady hand. Most likely yours, Preston. Preston swallowed hard, the arrogant smirk completely melting off his face. He opened his mouth to argue, but Sterling cut him off with a sharp look. Before you speak, I need to remind your counsel of his ethical obligations, Sterling said, shifting his piercing gaze to the shady attorney who was already beginning to perspire. Presenting a forged legal document in an attempt to unlawfully seize real estate is a felony in this state. If you do not take this piece of paper off my table and walk out that front door right now, I will personally see to it that you are disbarred by Friday afternoon. The cheap lawyer did not hesitate for a single second. He snatched the forged document off the table, shoved it haphazardly into his scuffed briefcase, and practically sprinted out of the dining room without saying a word to his client. We heard the heavy front door open and slam shut a few moments later. Preston was left completely exposed. He was standing in my dining room, without legal representation, without a valid claim to my property, and without a single shred of his manufactured confidence. Jasmine stood beside him, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and rising panic. Preston, what is he talking about? Jasmine asked, her voice trembling, as she looked at her husband. Tell him he is wrong. Tell him we have the rights to the house. Sterling closed his leather portfolio with a soft thud. He cannot tell you I am wrong, Jasmine, because he is currently facing much larger problems than a forged real estate document. Zuri retained my services this afternoon not just to oversee a civil eviction, but for criminal consultation. Sterling leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. My office spent the last 3 hours reviewing the dossier Zuri compiled from your abandoned briefcase. At exactly 4 o'clock today, I formally submitted the entire package to the White-Collar Crime Division of the FBI. They now have the eviction notices, the margin calls, the civil summons from the 3 families you robbed, and the fraudulent hard money loan application you plan to secure using my client's home as collateral. Preston stumbled backward, as if he had been physically struck. His shoulder hit the doorframe and he leaned against the wood to keep himself upright. The color drained from his face so completely he looked like a corpse. And just to ensure they prioritize the investigation, Sterling added, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, we also provided the federal agents with the high-definition audio recording of you attempting to blackmail a licensed financial auditor with fabricated federal crimes. You are not getting this house, Preston. You are getting a federal indictment. The absolute silence that followed Sterling's words was deafening. The illusion was completely shattered. There were no more legal loopholes to exploit. There were no more manipulative lies to spin. The dominoes had finally fallen, and Preston was standing directly underneath them. Jasmine slowly turned to look at her husband. The flawless, wealthy narrative she had built her entire identity around was crumbling to dust right in front of her eyes. FBI, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the revelation. Preston, what did you do? Did you steal money? Preston looked at her, and the last remaining shred of his polished facade vanished into thin air. He did not apologize. He did not try to comfort his weeping wife. He completely snapped. The sheer suffocating terror of his impending prison sentence morphed instantly into violent, venomous rage, and he aimed all of it directly at Jasmine. What did I do? Preston roared, the sound echoing violently off the dining room walls. I did what I had to do to keep you happy. You think those designer bags just magically appear? You think our trips to Dubai and Aspen pay for themselves? You maxed out every single credit card we had in the first 2 years of our marriage just so you could look like a celebrity on the internet. He stepped toward her, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated hatred. You drained my accounts, Jasmine. Every time I told you we needed to cut back, every time I said we could not afford your lifestyle, you threw a massive tantrum. You threatened to leave me. You told me a real man would provide the luxury you deserved, so I provided it. I took the money from my clients because you absolutely refused to stop spending. You built your fake little empire on the money I stole, and now I am going to federal prison for it." Jasmine's face flushed with a furious, ugly red. She did not take an ounce of accountability. The idea that her insatiable greed was the root cause of their destruction was entirely unacceptable to her narcissistic brain. "How dare you blame me?" she screamed, her voice shrill and piercing. "You told me you were a top-tier broker. You told me you were making millions of dollars. You lied to me from the day we met. You are a broke, pathetic failure." "I am a failure," Preston yelled back. He stepped out of the dining room and backed into the foyer, desperately trying to put physical distance between himself and my lawyer. Jasmine followed him right into the entryway, unwilling to let him walk away from the fight. "You are 32 years old and you have never worked a single day in your life. You are a parasite." The argument escalated from vicious screaming to physical violence in a matter of seconds. Jasmine raised her hand and slapped him directly across the face. The sound of her palm striking his cheek cracked through the quiet house like a whip. "Do not ever speak to me like that." Jasmine shrieked, tears of pure rage streaming down her face. "I am going to divorce you. I am going to take everything you have." Preston let out a dark, manic laugh, rubbing his red cheek. "Take what, Jasmine? I have absolutely nothing left. We are completely broke. The bank took the cars, the landlord locked us out of the townhouse, and now your sister is throwing us out onto the street. You are going to be living in a cheap motel by midnight." I stood in the doorway of the dining room, watching them tear each other apart under the bright crystal chandelier in my foyer. Just 24 hours ago, they had sat at my table, completely united in their arrogant, calculated plan to steal my home and destroy my peace. They had smiled as they handed me an eviction notice. Now they were a spectacular, messy collision of ruined egos, shattered lies, and mutual hatred. The united front they had used to terrorize me was dead. The massive security guard I had stationed on the front porch stepped through the open doorway, alerted by the shouting and the sound of the slap. He looked at me, his hand resting near his radio, silently waiting for the command. "Get them out of my house," I said firmly. I held up my hand, signaling the massive security guard to pause for just a moment. I did not want Preston to be forcefully dragged out of my house. I wanted him to walk out on his own, fully aware that he had been completely defeated. I stepped past Jasmine, who was still weeping hysterically on the foyer rug, and walked right up to Preston. Preston was backed against the heavy oak console table, breathing rapidly, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat. "I want you to look out the front window, Preston," I said quietly. He swallowed hard and turned his head toward the glass panels flanking the front door. Down at the very end of my long driveway, parked directly under the warm glow of the street lamp, was a black and white police cruiser. The headlights were off, but the silhouette of the vehicle was unmistakable. I had called the local precinct while Sterling was reviewing the forged document requesting a standby unit, just in case the situation turned physically violent. "You have two choices right now," I told him, making sure my voice was loud enough for my lawyer to hear from the dining room. "You can walk out that front door, get off my property, and take your chances with the federal authorities tomorrow morning. Or I can wave my hand at that patrol car and they will arrest you tonight for criminal trespassing and uttering a forged legal document." Preston looked at the police cruiser, then back at me. The absolute terror in his eyes was deeply satisfying. He did not say a single word. He did not grab his coat. He pushed past the security guard, shoved the front door open, and ran down the brick steps into the freezing December night. He did not run toward Jasmine's car. He ran down the street, disappearing into the darkness, fleeing from the inevitable consequences of his own arrogance. Jasmine watched him run away, her face buried in her hands. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her. She had no husband to protect her, no money to fund her delusions, and absolutely nowhere to go. Before I could even address my sister, the front door swung open again. My parents, Roland and Vivian, slowly stepped into the foyer. They had never actually left the neighborhood. They had parked their car 3 streets over, waiting to see if Preston's forged power of attorney would successfully force me out so they could casually return and reclaim their comfortable bedrooms. But from their vantage point, they had just watched Preston sprint away like a fugitive. They took one look at Jasmine sobbing on the floor and my high-powered attorney stepping out of the dining room, and they immediately realized they had bet their entire future on the wrong horse. Zuri. My mother started, her voice shaking as she attempted to completely rewrite history in real time. We had no idea he was going to try and forge a document. We just drove back because we were so worried about you. Preston manipulated us. He lied to us. My father nodded enthusiastically, stepping forward with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He tricked us, Zuri. You know how much we love you. We are family. We can get through this together. Just let us stay tonight and we will figure everything out in the morning. Jasmine needs her family right now. I looked at the three of them. Just hours ago, they had stood in the church lobby and watched me be publicly humiliated, hoping the social pressure would force me to hand over my home to a criminal. Now, with their golden child exposed and their fake empire in ruins, they wanted to play the loving family card. I walked over to the console table, picked up my leather wallet, and pulled out 2 plastic hotel key cards. I tossed them onto the polished wood. They landed with a sharp clatter. I paid for 1 week at the Marriott downtown. I said, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. I put the reservation under your name, Dad. That gives you exactly 7 days to find an apartment. After that, you are all on your own. Jasmine looked up at me, her mascara completely ruined. You are kicking us out on Christmas weekend, she sobbed, trying to play the victim one last time. No, I replied smoothly. I am evicting a group of hostile tenants who tried to steal my property. Take the keys and get out of my house. The security guard stepped forward, towering over my father. You heard the homeowner, the guard rumbled. Time to go. My father looked at the key cards, then at the armed guard. He silently picked the plastic cards off the table. He grabbed Jasmine by the arm, hauling her to her feet. My mother wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, refusing to meet my gaze. The three of them walked out the front door, dragging their shattered egos into the cold night air. The heavy door clicked shut behind them and the deadbolt locked automatically. For the first time in 10 years, the house was completely silent, and it finally belonged entirely to me. 1 year later, the loud, joyful sound of classic soul music filled the exact same foyer. I was walking down the staircase wearing a stunning red silk dress, feeling lighter and happier than I ever thought possible. The house was completely unrecognizable. I had spent the last 12 months stripping away every single trace of my parents' pretentious, stuffy decor. The dark, depressing mahogany furniture and heavy velvet drapes were gone. I had knocked down the kitchen walls, creating the bright, modern, open-concept space that Jasmine had wanted, but I did it with my own money and my own vision. The walls were painted in warm, inviting tones, and the house smelled like roasted garlic, fresh herbs, and genuine joy. I walked into the kitchen where my partner Julian was standing at the massive quartz island. Julian was a brilliant architect I had met a few months after the eviction. He was kind, incredibly supportive, and most importantly, he loved me for exactly who I was, not for what I could provide. He was laughing warmly as he carved the Christmas turkey, surrounded by the incredible group of people I had invited to share the holiday. My mentor from the accounting firm, Elise, was pouring wine at the dining table. My closest friends from college were gathered around the fireplace, sharing stories and eating appetizers. There was no tension in the air. There was no walking on eggshells, no pretending to be someone else, and no fear of saying the wrong thing. I had completely replaced the toxic bloodline I was born into with a chosen family built on mutual respect, love, and authentic connection. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, simply absorbing the beautiful scene. The trauma of the past was still there, a scar that I would carry for the rest of my life, but it no longer defined me. I had cut the infection out of my life, and the wound had finally healed. Julian looked up from the turkey. caught my eye and offered me a smile so full of genuine love that it brought a happy tear to my eye. Later that evening, after the plates were cleared and the dessert was served, Julian stood up and raised his glass of champagne. To Zuri, he said, his voice ringing clearly over the soft background music. To the strongest, most brilliant woman I know. You built this beautiful home, you built an incredible life, and you brought all of us together. We love you. The room erupted into cheers and raised glasses. I smiled, taking a sip of the crisp champagne. It was the perfect moment to reflect on just how much had changed since the last time I sat at this dining table on Christmas. My high-powered attorney had been completely true to his word. The FBI moved swiftly after receiving my dossier. Preston was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. Because the evidence I provided was so overwhelmingly absolute, his public defender forced him to take a plea deal. Preston is currently sitting in a federal penitentiary serving a 5-year sentence. Jasmine did not get the luxury of playing the wealthy housewife anymore. Without Preston's stolen money and without my financial safety net, reality hit her like a freight train. She was forced to sell her designer bags and her leased Mercedes just to pay off her immediate debts. She now works a minimum wage retail job at a local mall, forced to ring up the very same luxury clothes she used to brag about on social media. She lives in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city with my parents. Roland and Vivian have completely vanished from the affluent social circles they used to dominate. They can no longer afford their country club dues, and the massive scandal at the church made them social pariahs. They spend their days trapped in that tiny apartment with a bitter, angry daughter constantly arguing about money. They got exactly the life they deserved. I excused myself from the table, grabbed my glass of wine, and stepped out onto the expansive back porch. The December air was freezing, but I barely felt it. I looked out over the perfectly manicured lawn, the frosted trees shimmering under the moonlight. For the first 35 years of my life, I believed that family was an unbreakable bond. I believed that because we shared the same blood, I was obligated to set myself on fire just to keep them warm. I thought my worth was tied to how well I could clean up their messes and protect their secrets. But standing on that porch, looking at the property that was legally and morally mine, I realized the ultimate truth. Blood does not demand loyalty when it comes packaged with disrespect. Forgiveness does not mean giving toxic people access to your peace. I did not just reclaim a piece of real estate that night. I reclaimed my self-worth. I reclaimed my future. I reclaimed my crown, and I promised myself I would never let anyone try to take it from me, ever again. If you have ever had to draw a hard line with toxic family members, if you have ever had to choose your own peace over keeping up appearances, I want you to drop a heart in the comments below. Let me know you are watching and let me know you survived. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with anyone who needs a reminder that it is perfectly okay to walk away from people who only love what they can use. Thank you so much for listening to my journey. Remember, you hold the pen to your own life story. Do not ever let anyone else write your ending.